The truck backed up to Patty's fence line just after sunup. The bed lifted, and thousands of pecan shells came crashing down against her gate. They dumped the load, destroyed the gate, then looked back laughing as the truck pulled away. Patty's son stared at the damage and shook his head, but Patty walked past the broken gate. She reached into the pile, lifted a handful of shells, and turned them slowly in her palm. She grabbed another handful, sorting the solid shells from the damp and dusty ones. Her son studied the damage. Patty studied the opportunity. A week later, another mill truck arrived. Before the driver could unload, Patty waved him down and made him wait. She wanted the exact weight of the load and the driver's signature beside it. He looked at the pile, then back at her. It was garbage. Why would the weight matter? Patty held out the slip until he signed. Then she scooped a sample from the fresh load into a glass jar and wrote the date across the lid. The following week, she did it again. Another load, another signed weight, another dated jar. Inside the barn, the jars began filling an entire shelf. Beside them sat a ledger packed with load weights and short notes in Patty's handwriting. Near the wall, she kept a separate pile of shells she had chosen by feel. No one at the mill asked why Patty wanted every load weighed, and no one noticed she was saving a sample from each one. Most people would have called someone to haul the pile away. Patty started sorting it by hand. Morning after morning, before the dew burned off, she worked through the shells one scoop at a time. Some went into clean piles. Others went into a heap off to the side. She could not fully explain how she told them apart. The good shells felt dry, clean, and heavy for their size. Patty had worked around pecans her whole life. Her hands had learned things she had never needed to put into words. Then one morning, a fresh load stopped her cold. She pushed her fingers beneath the surface and pulled them back. The shells underneath felt damp. A fine gray dust rose into the air. Patty turned a handful over, then pointed toward the far end of the lot. The entire load went there. She would not mix it with the others. She could not explain exactly what was wrong. She only knew it failed the test in her hands. Drivers passing the farm saw a woman sorting one pile of waste from another. Some laughed. To them, she was getting particular about garbage. Patty kept working. Behind the barn, she placed a small batch of the shells she had saved into a metal firebox and lit them. It was not a cookout. It was a test. She watched the smoke rise, studied its color, and timed how long the shells held heat. When the fire settled, she opened her ledger and wrote down what she had seen. A few days later, Patty filled several plain paper bags. No label, no name. She carried them to a small roadside smokehouse where locals stopped for ribs and brisket on weekends. She made no promises. She left the bags beside the smoker and told the owner to try them. The following weekend, a few regulars came back asking for more. One older customer told her his brisket had burned cleaner than it had in years. The heat stayed steadier. The smoke needed less attention. He asked what she had put in the bag. Patty smiled and handed him another one, but the rejected load stayed in her mind. It looked almost identical to the shells people were now returning to buy. Same color, same size, same broken pieces. Her hands had known the difference. She still did not know why. And until Patty understood what made one batch burn clean and another turn useless, she was building a business around something she could not yet control. Word spread from the roadside smokehouse, and before long, Patty's bags reached a man who ran a barbecue joint in town. He agreed to test them during a real Saturday service. The briskets went on before sunrise. Good cuts, expensive meat, the kind that had to sell if the day was going to make money. He filled the smoker with Patty's shells and let them run. At first, nothing looked wrong. Then the smoke turned bitter. You could smell the trouble before you saw it. The heat ran uneven, too hot in one section, nearly dead in another. By the time he opened the smoker, the bark had gone dark and sharp, and the meat underneath carried a taste no customer would pay for. He pulled the entire batch. A full run of brisket went into the bin in the middle of service. The owner did not yell when Patty arrived. that would have been easier. He told her he could not put his name on food that came out like that, and he could not afford another Saturday spent guessing. Then he showed her the ruined meat. Patty looked into the bin. Good brisket. Wasted because of something she had handed him. She did not argue. She drove home with that image stuck in her mind. Back in the barn, the dated jars were still lined across the shelf. She pulled the sample from the damp, dusty load she had rejected weeks earlier and placed it beside what remained of the failed batch. The shells looked almost identical, but in her hands, the difference was clear. The good shells were heavier, thicker, and clean. The failed ones were thinner and lighter. When she rubbed them between her fingers, the same fine gray dust rose from the surface. Some still held moisture deep inside where it could not be seen. Thin shells, fine dust, hidden moisture. That was what her hands had been detecting all along. The burn had never been random. Thick, dry shells held steady heat. Thin, damp shells flared, faded, and turned the smoke bitter. For the first time, Patty's instinct had a measurable reason behind it. But knowing the problem was not the same as controlling it. Sorting a handful was easy. Controlling truckload after truckload, with every bag burning the same, was something else entirely. She could finally measure what was going wrong. Now she had to prove she could control it at scale. Picking good shells by hand was never going to work at scale, so Patty changed the process. She ground the heavy, dry shells into an even material, dried it carefully, then pressed it into firm pellets. Once cooled and cured, each batch burned nearly the same. That changed everything. Loose shells were unpredictable. One bag burned clean, the next turned bitter. Pellets gave her control. Same grind, same moisture, same size, same burn. She carried a bag back to the restaurant whose brisket she had ruined. The owner gave her one more chance. This time, the smoke stayed clean and steady from beginning to end. No bitter turn, no dead spots. The bark set dark and even. After tasting it, he gave her a standing weekly order. That order opened the door. Soon 3 local smokehouses were buying from Patty every week, not as a favor. They kept ordering because the pellets performed the same way every time. Her barn began to change. A few bags became stacks. Stacks became boxes. Boxes went on to pallets. Then a regional barbecue supply warehouse asked for a full pallet trial. For the first time, a forklift lifted shrink-wrapped pallets straight from Patty's yard. Her small experiment was becoming a real operation, and that was when the mill noticed. Its trucks were still delivering shells for free, but now they were pulling into a farm lined with finished pallets and watching product leave by the ton. The managers did the math. The shells they had treated as worthless were now being sold as something people wanted. So they made a simple business decision. They stopped the deliveries. No warning. No final load. No more shells. Patty had more orders than ever, and suddenly, nothing left to make them from. Patty had orders on the books, a warehouse waiting on a pallet, 3 smokehouses and a restaurant counting on her, and no new shells coming in. What she had left was all she had. When it ran out, she was done. Her son came to the farm and said what he had been thinking for weeks. The cutoff proved the business was too fragile. Everything depended on one mill, and the moment it stopped delivering, the whole operation stalled. "Sell the place," he told her. "Take the offer while there was still something left to sell." Patty heard him out, shook her head, and went back to the barn. No speech, no argument. She still had something he had not thought to look for. Her records. From the first load, she had tracked average weight, usable yield, moisture, and how much raw shell it took to make one finished pallet. She knew exactly how much she needed and what condition it had to be in. That changed who she could work with. 2 smaller Pecan operations sat within hauling distance. One was an old family sheller running decades-old machinery. The other was a newer yard with little storage and shells constantly piling up. Neither produced enough waste to interest a large hauler. Patty did not need either one to supply everything. She showed them how much she could take, what quality she required, and how regularly she could clear it away. Both agreed. Now she had shells again, but they came from two directions in partial loads. The warehouse trial required a full pallet, and separate shipments would not reach the minimum in time. So Patty routed both loads through the freight yard and combined them into one shipment. She filled the pallet trial on time and exactly to specification. The warehouse approved it. That trial became a standing regional order, putting her pellets on shelves far beyond the county. Every smaller order had earned the next one. Now she had recurring volume, scheduled pickups, and customers in places she could not reach herself. The mill had cut her off, expecting the business to collapse. Instead, Patty came back with two suppliers and a larger market. But while her operation was growing, the mill was beginning to discover what losing her had actually cost them. Back at the mill, the shells were piling up. The replacement hauler had looked cheaper on paper. But once the busy season hit, he raised his rates and still could not keep up. The pile spread across the loading yard. Shells blocked the docks. Trucks had less room to turn. Waste was beginning to slow the part of the mill that actually made money. Removing a full season's worth of shells week after week was harder to replace than they had expected. Patty had not simply been taking their trash. She had been the only nearby outlet capable of absorbing all of it without missing a load. One morning, a mill truck came up Patty's road again. The manager stepped out beside the same gate their workers had broken on the first delivery. Only now, the gate stood straight. He had come to make a deal. Patty was in no hurry. She already had two suppliers, more orders than she could easily fill, a signed distributor contract, and records proving exactly how much material she could process. She no longer needed the mill. The mill needed her. So the agreement was written on her terms. They guaranteed her a set seasonal volume. The shells became hers the moment each load reached the farm. Every delivery had to meet her moisture and cleanliness standards. And because Patty was clearing their entire waste stream reliably, the mill would now pay her a handling allowance for every load. The same trucks that once broke her gate and drove away laughing began returning on a schedule. This time, they arrived carefully. This time, they arrived under contract. And this time, they arrived paying. Her son stood near the road and directed the first truck toward the unloading area. 2 years earlier, those shells had been dumped on Patty because no one believed they were worth anything. Now they supported a 6-figure business. The mill had spent years trying to make the shells disappear. Patty built her future by seeing value where everyone else saw a problem.